Welcome back to the HTML5 Essential Training Series. I'm Mike King, your instructor, and in this tutorial we're going to be looking at coding attributes in HTML. Attributes are coded within the opening tag of an element or within an empty tag inside of HTML. For each attribute that you code, you need the following. You're going to need the attribute name, you'll want an equal sign, and you're going to want the attribute value that you're actually going to put with that attribute. When using HTML5, the attribute value does not have to be coded within quotation marks unless the value contains a space. This is a change from the previous versions of HTML. Throughout these tutorials, I will be enclosing all my attribute values in quotation marks, as during the transition between HTML5 and HTML, this is a best practice. Also important, the use of double or single quotes is available when inputting attributes. I tend to always use double quotes as it makes it easier for me to recognize coding errors quickly. And with the variety of languages that I use, coding my website's double quotes seems to work best for what I do. Alright, so let's move into the development environment and look at some examples of using attributes in HTML. Alright, so what we're going to do is let's go ahead and drop down into our development environment. So let me get rid of this presentation. As usual, I'm going to confirm that my XAMPP web server is up and running. So you want to make sure that your web server is up and running. You're probably running Apache, which is what you should be running. That's cool. All right, so we got that. We want to go ahead, let me real quick show you the directory structure that we're going to be using. I'm actually in the coding attributes directory of my web root. I have nothing in root currently other than my images folder. The images folder, it's holding the 3 placeholder graphics that we used in the previous tutorial. I don't think I'll be using them in this one, but they're still there, so we're just going to leave them there. And this is where we'll be creating our files that we're going to see in our web browser. So let's go ahead and pull up the web browser. Okay, so we're all loaded up in the web root of our directory. We've got our browser up and running. We've got our text editor open with our empty file. I'm going to go ahead and copy the file from my exercise folder. From my exercise file, I'm going to copy this into my text editor. I want to save this. Let's make sure our word wrap is on so we can see everything on the screen. I want to save this as a basic template.html. This will be the file where we're going to make most of our demonstrations, so you can see what we're talking about as we work through these attribute demonstrations. So now if I refresh this in my browser window, you'll see we've got the basic template HTML up, and we've got our document up so we can actually start looking at adding attributes to our HTML document. Alright, so as we talked about in our presentation, attributes are coded within the opening tag of an HTML element or within an empty tag. So let's demonstrate some attribute examples so that you can see what I'm talking about when we're talking about attributes in HTML. The first thing I want to do is let's go ahead, I'm going to take an image tag, and we know that that's an empty element because it doesn't have a closing tag. And right below my heading, I'm going to go ahead and paste that image tag in. Now it'd be a good time to pause if you need to, so you can put this in. So in this example, the first attribute given is the source location in the image that we're looking to load. So this source, this src, is an attribute for this particular image tag. And what that attribute does is it tells the image tag where the location is of the image file that needs to be loaded. So it's telling it to go into the image directory. And if you remember from a root directory of our file, when we looked at the root, we have this images directory. And it's telling inside the images directory, it will see, and actually just saw it there, 125 by 125 pixel placeholder. So it's telling it to go in and load that particular placeholder in that images directory. We also have a second attribute in this image tag that's called the alt attribute. And this is a welcome page image, is basically text that appears with a screen reader or in the event that it can't find the image when it's trying to load the file. Let's go ahead and save all these changes. Bring this file back up in our browser window, and you'll see now that we've got that image up from that image tag. So those pretty interesting. I mean, they're attributes inside of our HTML tags. Most HTML tags do have base attributes. The image tag actually has a source attribute because we got to identify where the image is, and it's got an alt attribute because we want to tell it what the alternative text is for screen readers and in the event the image is not loaded. So let's look at another tag and another attribute that we've used quite a bit in previous tutorials. I'm going to go up here under this section, and I'm going to put in a div tag, and I'm going to type in class equal main. And if you've been following along in the previous tutorials, let's go ahead and actually close this too. I want to go ahead and tab these in because I like keeping my indentations. It makes it a lot easier when I'm programming if I keep track of where things are. And remember, because we're using a div tag, what I would normally do is I'd actually put a comment here saying closing main. And if you remember from earlier tutorials, I said it doesn't look like it's important right now, but that comment on a regular web page would be extremely important because some of these tags can be hundreds of lines apart. So let's go ahead and save that change. But the point I was trying to make with this one is that div tag has a class attribute. We've given it the attribute class and we've given it a name of main. We've seen this attribute in previous tutorials. This gives a class identification to the element that we can use that class identification through CSS and help style that particular group based on whatever's inside that div tag. And we talked about that and we've demonstrated that in some other tutorials. We did the same thing, if you remember correctly, with ID. The ID tag is another attribute that we can have inside of an HTML element, and again, it tells us what the identification is of that group for styling. Remember, the difference between ID and class is I can only have one ID per page when I'm actually assigning these things identifications, but with classes I can have numerous groups that are classed the same, but I can only have one ID. For instance, I could have only one main on this particular HTML page, but if I turn this into a class, I could have numerous mains on the HTML page, and that's just one of the rules of CSS and using IDs and classes in HTML. So in a previous tutorial and throughout the CS tutorials, we used IDs to help us style sections of the HTML page. We've seen this attribute in previous tutorials also, and that's the class attribute. This gives an identification name to the elements, and again, we mainly use those for styling. Each ID name, as we just talked about, must be unique for every HTML page. But those are two attributes that you'll use frequently as you're designing HTML websites or web pages. You're going to use the ID and the class names very, very frequently because, again, we use those with CSS to help style our documents. So let's look at a tag that's used quite often in HTML and has quite a few different types of attributes. And we're actually going to use this tag with a few different attributes on it because, again, I want you to see how we use these inside of our HTML documents. I'm going to go right below that heading tag, and I'm going to type in a new tag. Let me actually expand this a little bit so we can get this all on one line. And this is an A tag, or an anchor tag as it's called in HTML. And currently, the way I've set this up, I have three different attributes with this anchor tag. The first attribute is the href. It's the link attribute and gives us the destination of this particular link because an A tag in HTML is a hyperlink. That's the whole purpose of A tags. It links to other documents, links to other websites, it links to other URLs. But it's very, very important, and it's what makes websites websites. But again, A tag, href, an attribute of the A tag. The next attribute we're going to talk about is the title attribute. This attribute defines extra information about this element. This information is often used and shown as a tooltip when the mouse is hovered over it. You're going to see that in a minute when I demonstrate it inside of our browser window. This title tag actually gives us text that's going to appear over that attribute or over that element as I hover over it. And then to show you that we can use classes and IDs in any of our tags, or almost all of our HTML tags, I put a class of top nav on this. So this could actually have its own styling class if I had this as part of a navigation system. So in this particular demonstration, we have three different attributes on this single individual tag. And keep in mind, an A tag is a standard element, so it would have to have a closing tag, so I'm going to go ahead and put a closing tag on this A tag. And what I put in between these opening and closing braces, in other words, the greater than sign and the less than sign, is what's going to appear on the page itself. So I'm just going to put in here sample text. I'm going to go ahead and save that change. Let's go ahead and you can pause right now if you need to type this in. I'm going to go ahead and take my text editor back down to its normal size so I can be in my dual window environment. I want to refresh my page, and you'll notice now I have that sample text hyperlink at the top. And if I hover over it, it should give us, and there you see, it takes the viewer to the About page. You'll see the little pop-up window, and it's getting that text from this title. That's what it means by that title text. Also, again, screen viewer or screen reader for visually impaired, it would actually read that. It would say you've got a link on this page that takes the viewer to the About page as part of the screen reading. So as we move through the tutorials, another attribute that you're going to become familiar with is a boolean attribute. And that's the next one we're going to look at. So let's go in here. I'm going to go ahead and take another tag. This is a little bit different tag. We haven't seen this tag yet inside of any of our documents. I'm going to come below my div, and I'm going to paste this input tag in. And you'll notice it's got two attributes. It actually has three, and we'll talk about the third one in a second because you haven't seen one like this before. It actually has a type attribute, which tells us what type of input element this is, and particularly in this one, it's a checkbox. It also has a name. We've given this attribute a name, and the name attribute gives a name to the element. A lot of times we use this name when we're actually using scripting languages to refer to the actual element. And the third attribute is check, but you'll notice it doesn't have the three parts of a normal attribute. It doesn't have the attribute name, the value, and the equal sign. It actually just has checked, and that's because it's a boolean attribute. So by putting checked there, it tells this checkbox that when you appear in my web browser, by default, you have a check mark in you. Let's go ahead and save this change, and I'll show you what I mean. So let's save this and refresh our browser window. And you're going to see when that checkbox comes up down there at the bottom, it actually gives us a check mark in it because I have checked here. It's a boolean value. It's either checked or it's unchecked. You're going to see a lot of input elements as we go through these tutorials because we're going to be doing a lot of stuff as we get further along the line. We're going to be doing a lot of things with forms, and we use a lot of these type of elements on forms. The different types of elements that we can have that are input elements that are new to HTML5 are color, date, date-time local, month, week, time, email, number, range, search, tell, and URL. Whew. That's a bunch. We used to have just a few input types in our older versions of HTML. HTML5 has added a bunch of new input types, which actually is going to make it very interesting when we start doing new things with forms. But real quick, let me show you what I mean by the boolean element. Let's go ahead and take this checked out. I'm going to go ahead and save that change inside of our HTML document. When I refresh the window, we should still have our checkbox, but because we took the boolean checked out of the attributes, now my checkbox should not be checked. And you'll notice the check marks, once we refresh that screen, the check mark has gone away because we actually removed checked from the attributes of the input selector, or the input element. Okay, so keep that in mind that some of the attributes inside of HTML will only require one value when they're boolean, and that's checked or unchecked, and you're going to see other examples of this as we move through the tutorials. All right, so I hope that gives you an idea of what working with attributes are in HTML. Let's drop out of here real quick because I actually want to go into our presentation for a minute and finish some stuff up. So let's close out that browser. So the rules of the road when we're configuring attributes. An attribute consists of the attribute name, an equal sign, and the attribute value. And remember, the only exception to that is the boolean attributes. Attribute values in HTML5 do not have to be enclosed in quotation marks as long as they have no spaces in them. And again, we're going to follow the old best practice standards and enclose those in quotation marks. But if you're poking around people's websites or web pages and you happen to see attributes without quotation marks, remember, in HTML5 they're not required as long as there's no spaces in the attribute value. Attribute values must be enclosed in quotation marks if they have any spaces in the value, and that's true. I mean, we just basically discussed that. Boolean attributes can be coded using just the attribute name. If the name is there, it's a true. If the name is not there, it's a false. To code multiple attributes, separate each attribute with a space. And we've done that. We demonstrated that with the three attributes we had up earlier. For consistency's sake, I always code my attributes in double quotes. And again, it's my personal preference because of the different languages I use. You will find your own best practice, your own standard that you will like. Just stay consistent as you work through the exercises. Once you come up with a plan that you like to use, stay consistent with it. Attributes can be coded within opening or empty tags to supply additional or optional values for that particular element. A Boolean attribute represents either an on or an off. It's a true or false. And the ID attribute is used to identify a single HTML element, so its value can be used for only one element on the HTML page. Remember that. And that's one of the biggest things to remember as we move further along in these tutorials, because as we get closer and closer to developing the website, we're going to be doing a lot of stuff with CSS. Remember, an ID can only be used once per page. Classes can be used multiple times per page. And a class attribute with the same value can be used for more than one HTML element on that HTML page. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial on coding attributes in HTML. I hope this answered any questions that you have on the attributes. If not, just drop me an email. I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial.